You're watching Moments with Jill Walker. Today I'm talking about stones, part 2. Yesterday I talked about stones, part 1, and the story was about Stephen. I'll continue that a little bit because I want to explain why I was holding this blue robe yesterday and why I'm holding it again today. You see, when Stephen was being stoned, it really wasn't for a good reason. He actually was being persecuted for no reason. It says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, them that are godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. So if you are walking with Jesus and living a godly life and you find yourself being persecuted from time to time, that's a good sign. Because that verse I just quoted in 2 Timothy 3:12 says, them that are godly in Christ Jesus shall, that's affirmative, shall suffer persecution. Going back to the story in Acts chapter 7, with Stephen being stoned, Saul was standing there as a witness among other people. And it says in Acts 7:58 that Stephen was cast out of the city and he was stoned. He was stoned. I'm not talking about like a few little rocks like I showed you yesterday, but I'm talking about a lot bigger stones. Can you imagine? He was being stoned so badly that he died. But right before his death, there was witnesses there. And one of them was Saul. He was one to persecute the Christians. And it says in Acts 7:58 that as Stephen was being stoned, the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. So we don't know for sure if Saul was holding part of Stephen's clothes. We don't know that for sure, but it's kind of assumed that possibly could be the case. And so Stephen was being stoned for what was right. Acts 7 verse 60, you see another side of this story, because when Stephen was being stoned, he didn't get all angry and mad at the crowd and curse them. No, he had a Christ-like spirit till his last breath, because it goes on to say in verse 60 that Stephen kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And then he died. That kind of reminds me of Jesus when he was on the cross. In Luke 23:34, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When you're being persecuted, you have to remember the same thing that Stephen thought in his heart and even said with his mouth, and that Jesus himself, who's our greatest example, said in his last few moments on the cross. They both said similar things. They had love and forgiveness for those who were persecuting them. They saw beyond the persecution, and they realized that the heart of those that were persecuting them was not looking at it correctly. They weren't seeing it in the light of the scriptures and in the light of Jesus' love. You see, when people persecute you, it may not be with stones. It may be with words. And I'm thinking of that little saying I heard as a child, and it's so untrue. Sticks and stones, and I'm really not near too many sticks right now, but sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, that's not true either, because words can hurt a person. Words and rejection can be so damaging for years or even for life. There's adults walking around today, you might be one of them, that has had emotional damage just from words of persecution you had even as a child. But you need to go on with your life and forgive those who have persecuted you. It may not be with stones, but you still need to forgive them. If we can get to the point, as Stephen was on his death, dying words saying, lay not this sin to their charge. And as Jesus, just moments before he was dying, being crucified on that cross, said, Father, Forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, as it talks about in Ephesians chapter 6, but we wrestle with principalities and powers and rulers of darkness and spiritual wickedness in high places. So we're really not dealing with the face of that person, even though they are responsible for their actions. But behind their face is something that is probably from the demonic world. I'm not saying they're always demon possessed. I'm not saying that. That may not be the case, but they're being used from the enemy of our soul to do damage to our emotions and to ruin our life. Don't let them do it, but reach out in God's love and forgive them. That will really throw the devil off guard, won't it? Because he doesn't want us to forgive people, but forgive those who've hurt you, just as Jesus has forgiven you. Well, it says in Luke chapter 6, verses 22 and 23, "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, separate you, reproach you, cast you out for the Son of Man's sake." And that next verse is a little bit different, because it says in Luke chapter 6, verse 23, "Rejoice in that day and leap for joy." You want to know a secret? I did try that once. I really did. It was years ago in a former house where we used to live, a bi-level home. And as a minister of the gospel, some of the people didn't like what I was saying, and a few of them left the church. And it did hurt, but I was feeling a little sad. And as I was down in the basement of my bi-level home, I felt like God reminded me of that verse in Luke 6:23. Well, I looked around. My boys were living at home then. They were younger, living at home, and no one was in the house, I don't think. But I felt like God was saying, just leap for joy. Throw the devil for a loop. Instead of having a pity party, rejoice, because them that are godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. So I looked around and I thought, I'll go for it. And I leaped right there in my family room all by myself. I did feel a little bit better. Hey, it's better than throwing stones at people, even with our words, right? So when you're being persecuted, you're not exempt, because Jesus himself said in the book of John, "In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer." He says, "I have overcome the world." So the next time you see stones, think of these last two devotionals I've given you yesterday and today, and rejoice, and even possibly leap for joy. That's scriptural too, because you're suffering for Christ, and someday, as it says, even in Luke chapter 6, verse 23, that your reward will be great someday in heaven. You've been watching Moments with Jill Walker. God bless you today.